Classical conditioning. The definition of classical conditioning is two stimuli linked together to produce a new learned response in a person or animal. Classical conditioning is a type of learning that had a major influence on the school of thought in psychology known as behaviorism. Classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Pavlov unintentionally during his research with animal gastric systems. Pavlov found that the dogs produced more salivation when they heard, smelled, or anticipated for food. This was a natural response. However, the dogs began to salivate to unrelated events. Pavlov started feeding the dogs and playing sounds prior to being fed. Pavlov found that the dogs could be conditioned to unconsciously associate neutral events with being fed. Ivan Pavlov theorized behavior is learned by repetitive association between the response and the stimulus. The classical conditioning process contains 5 steps. The first step is having an unconditioned stimulus that causes a reaction in every way. Second is having an unconditioned response that happens when the unconditioned stimulus is presented. Third is having a neutral stimulus. Initially, it does not produce a response, but after being paired with an unconditioned stimulus, it becomes a conditioned stimulus that then triggers a conditioned response. Fourth is having a conditioned stimulus, the object that does not bring out the desired response. Finally, we have the conditioned response, a particular behavior an organism learns to produce when conditioned stimulus is presented. For Pavlov's experiment, he placed each dog in an isolated environment restrained with a harness with a bowl of food and a device that would measure a rate of the salivation secretions. The measurements would then be recorded and Pavlov would monitor the salivation rates throughout the experiment. Before the conditioning, the meat was the unconditioned stimulus that makes the dog salivate when presented in front of them. Before he served the meat, he would ring a bell, which is the neutral stimulus that initially does not produce a response, and serve the food. The dogs had no response to the bell. During the experiment, Pavlov rang the bell and served the dogs meat, which at this point the meat remained as the unconditioned stimulus, and the bell became the conditioned stimulus because it was associated with the meat that produced the salivation. After conditioning, Pavlov found that when he just rang the bell, the dogs would salivate as a result of the conditioned stimulus. The dogs produced a conditioned response associating the bell with meat. After being conditioned, the dogs learned to salivate with the bell whenever they hear it. Classical conditioning can be applied to animals and people.